Well, if you love golf like I do, there are a few places you fantasize about being in person at some point in time. Like on the first tee at St. Andrews, the place where it all began. Or the 18th hole at Pebble Beach, overlooking that iconic view. Or relative to this week, at Amen Corner of Augusta National Golf Club during the Masters. I'm sure none of you are streaming it this morning on your phones as I'm preaching. Of course, our loves and passions are all different, so while the idea is similar, the venue changes. Perhaps for you, it's sitting in Carnegie Hall listening to an opera, or scaling Mount Everest and taking in that view, or standing in the Louvre, staring at the Mona Lisa. There's something inside of us that yearns for the experience of it all, of not just being outside observers or those who watch from a distance, but rather of being part of an ongoing story, one that's near and dear to our hearts. Or at least that's true of our neighbor's 4-year-old son, Tommy, who comes over to visit just about every day. He loves the Marvel comic series, and so it's no surprise that when he arrives, he's never just Tommy, but usually dressed up as either Spider-Man or Captain America or Aquaman. Although I don't think his catchphrase comes from the Marvel comic series. He'll ride his bike down the hill into our driveway, cape flapping in the wind behind him as he shouts, "Look out! I'm coming in hot, sweet potato!" Of course, he's not alone. We've all competed on the playground for who might be Batman or Robin. Or perhaps more recently, it's been Harry Potter or Ron Weasley. The point is, it's not enough to read or hear or watch the story unfold. No, we yearn to be involved, to become those who give shape to or even make a story somehow unfold. And it's not just with our secular stories, it's with our religious ones too. I mean, how many Christians travel to the Holy Land every year to walk where Jesus walked? And while we all can't make that trip in our lifetime, at the very least we try and place ourselves in the shoes of the characters we read about. Like the prodigal son, for instance, or the elder son, or maybe the father himself. Or perhaps it's the priest, or the Levite, or the Good Samaritan, or maybe even the man lying in the ditch. Whatever the story, we do our best to not only read and hear about the faith of others, but to embody it in our everyday lives. After all, that's what being a person of faith is ultimately all about. Living our story. Except that is this part of the story. Or at least that's the case for me. I can remember being in the grocery store a couple of years ago, just before Holy Week, when I ran into a clergy colleague of mine at the time. She said to me, "Well, it's that time of year again. Are you ready to put Jesus in the tomb and then raise him again from the dead?" I thought to myself, no. Not really. Which seems ironic now because as a child I loved to participate in the processional on Palm Sunday. Waving branches while the congregation sang all glory, laud, and honor. There was something about participating in this worship service in that way that was unlike anything else we did in the church. But then at some point along the way I came to terms with how this story will unfold. The way in which this day foreshadows the events that will take place in this week that we call holy. And quite frankly, I became content with being a bystander, watching from a distance, allowing Jesus to suffer for me, not with me. Seemed a lot more safe that way. And I don't think I'm alone. Or at least I don't think it's any coincidence the least attended worship services of the year in every church tend to be on Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday, and Holy Saturday. Reading words like crucify him, singing songs like Were You There, stripping the altar and covering it in black, those are just things we prefer not do. You see, it's just easier to move from the hosannas of Palm Sunday to the hallelujahs of Easter morning. It's just easier to not place ourselves in this part of the story. Especially after hearing again what our particular role would entail in our reading from Luke this morning. Even if we thought the story would end as the disciples did, with Jesus on the throne, us sitting at his right hand or his left, I'm not sure I'd be all that excited about what I'd have to do to help him get there. I mean, let's be honest, half of Luke's reading is spent on the disciples being, well, for lack of a better term, donkey fetchers. Don't you remember? Go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you'll find tied there a colt that's never been ridden. Untie it, bring it here. And then there's all this business about what they should say if anyone asks them, and what they should do once they have the colt in hand. In fact, Luke and Mark, both in telling this story, spend more than half of their time in the mundane details of the disciples running errands for Jesus. I don't know about you, but I always thought following Jesus would be a little more dignified than going about doing his chores, mucking around in the mire of a donkey stable. In fact, it's what we in the church profess to believe. Just go in the book of worship for any denomination and you'll find it there in the liturgy. We ask of our new members questions like, do you promise to gladly and openly serve Jesus Christ in your ministry? We ask of those who we commission to special ministries, will you seek to serve God's people with energy, intelligence, imagination, and love? We ask of those we ordain questions like, will you, in your own like, seek to follow the Lord Jesus, love your neighbors, and work for the reconciliation of the world? Questions like that, well, they're enough to make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. These are questions about being something much, much bigger than stealing a donkey and explaining to the owner why the Lord needs it. A church I served previously had a partnership with the Salvation Army. And every Wednesday, we committed to serving lunch to the homeless. The same meal every week. Cornbread and beans. In part, this was to sort of simplify the ministry so that anyone who wanted to come participate could at any given time. Whoever showed up had the same instructions, the same ingredients for the same recipe, the same number of people who were needed to do the same preparation, the same number of people who were needed to serve at the same time and place. I remember being at an outreach meeting one evening when someone brought up changing the recipe for the cornbread. You would have thought World War III had broken out. We can't change the recipe. We've been doing it that way for years. Besides, those we serve, they tell us they love it. Well, I just thought it might be a little change. Maybe add a little flavor. For 45 minutes, this went on. Finally, an elder person sitting at the table who hadn't said a word up to this point replied, well, I guess all I know is if we didn't provide this meal every week, some of those folks wouldn't eat. All of a sudden, the room got eerily quiet. Must have been a good 30 seconds before anyone said anything. And the person who'd been defending that old recipe, she said, well, perhaps we should try something new. Who knows? They They might even like it better. While the story of our faith, which is essentially encapsulated in this coming week, is more than you or I could ever possibly articulate, I found that it's typically lived out in the simple, mundane actions by everyday people, people like you and like me. At meetings about cornbread and beans, in 2 hours on a Saturday morning at the CAC, in walking with people from other faith traditions to combat hunger in our community. In fact, I've often wondered if it's time we change our liturgies, that we ask a different set of questions. Do you promise to help fold bulletins on Thursday mornings? Do you affirm that you'll change light bulbs in the church building when it's necessary? Do you promise to sit with people in nursing homes who aren't quite sure who you are? Do you pledge to drive the youth to Texas City for their mission trip? Do you covenant to show up for choir rehearsal on Wednesday evenings, week in and week out? Do you commit to decorating the sanctuary for Easter morning? Do you pledge to teach children Sunday school once a week? Do you vow to do your best to attend worship on a regular basis? They might sound like minor details, perhaps even things we take for granted. And yet if they don't happen, if those things don't get done, how will the world know this story? Which is the reason God isn't just hoping you might participate. No, God is counting on it. Think about it. The disciples did the same. They go and find a boat for Jesus. They secure a room and prepare the meal. They chase down a donkey for the Lord to enter Jerusalem. And in fact, it won't be the risen Lord, but rather his followers who preach the first Easter sermon. He is risen. So today, my friends, we don't observe Palm Sunday, we become it. On Thursday, we don't just honor Maundy Thursday, we participate in it. On Friday, we don't recognize Good Friday, we embody it. And on Easter morning, we don't just celebrate resurrection, we're called to live it. I realize this sounds glorious, and it is. But most of the time it happens in those simple, everyday actions that won't always feel so remarkable. Like going to dinner on a Thursday night with your friends and confessing to them who you really are and what you really believe despite their disagreement. Or one Friday afternoon finally choosing to let die in you that resentment or that grudge or that addiction that's literally killing you. Or on a Sunday morning deciding to rise up against hunger in this world. Or stand up to that bully that just won't let up on your friend. Or lift up the poor, the marginalized, or the excluded, because you see, it's not enough to stand on the sidelines of this story. To dip our toes in the water every now and then when it's convenient, to be innocent bystanders who'd rather watch than participate, to hang around the edges and weigh in from a distance, but never willing to jump in and execute the details. No, this is a story that requires our full immersion. So keep speaking that quiet word in the committee meeting. Keep spending that time with that person who's incoherent and coming apart at the seams. Keep emptying that bedpan at the hospital. Or scratching a few desperate halting words on a legal pad while preparing to offer a prayer during worship on Sunday morning. Because the truth is, living this story usually looks like standing hip deep in the mire of some stable trying to corral a donkey for Jesus. Or at least that's what God is counting on. And believe it or not, of all people, God's depending on me and on you.